Jonathan.
Hi,
How are you?
good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Oh, it's so nice to see you.
Likewise.
How's everything going out there?
It's an interesting time. It's just a never-ending adventure to try to find clarity in what's actually going on and what will impact the housing market, right?
On the one hand, there's nothing on the market. On the other hand, rates, I will say, I have a client that just is about to close. I think we're closing next week. She just signed her commitment, 5%.
Yeah, yeah,
She
no,
paid a point,
yeah,
but it's still 5%, and it's a 7/6. So it's a 7 year. It adjusts every 6 months after 7 years. But as Jonathan will
yeah.
probably tell you, the average loan that people hold is not more than 7 years. So
Right. And also, mortgage rates, the 30-year has since August 1st has come down over 50 basis points. And so we're starting to see the uptick in activity nationally. Pending home sales data was up this month or last month. There's just more churn, more activity as the lower rates go, the more people, sort of fall into the market. And that's what's missing from this market is normal activity levels.
there's greater volume, but lower prices, right?
Uh, it depends. So, in the outlying suburbs of New York City, bidding wars still, and this is as of the second quarter, bidding wars still, depending on the local market, and I'm talking about primarily Westchester, Fairfield, and Nassau, Suffolk. Um, you're really talking about um, bidding war market share of about a third to as much as half of all the transactions are selling above the last asking price. So it still shows you how tight it is. And actually, over the last couple of months, there's been a lot of discussion about inventory rising. And yes, inventory is rising, but it's different across different regions. So in the Northeast, inventory actually has stopped rising, or we're not seeing the new inventory come on very much. Where it's really prevalent is the Sun Belt, Texas and Florida, where there's been a tremendous amount of inventory that's come in because their markets they can build faster, and uh, for whatever reason, there was sort of this overreaction to the migration of people moving from, say, California and New York City or the Northeast to go south during the pandemic. They responded much more quickly. So as a result, inventory is very different. It's low in the Northeast, low in the Midwest, moderate in the West, and high in the Sun Belt states. It's very different. In fact, that's the most, when you're thinking about valuing property or the direction of the market, inventory is the most important metric in housing today, in my mind, more than price direction, even more than sales, is the supply on the market.
What? Okay, let's elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, so when I think of when you think about the value of a property, you're thinking about, what is somebody going to buy it today and think they're going to, be able to sell it tomorrow for. And and the last thing, but the consumer always looks at first, is price direction. Are prices rising, prices falling? But to date myself, and I probably say this every time I'm on here, is that prices are the caboose at the end of the train if trains still had cabooses. It's just it's after the dust settles, that's price, but really transactions lead the way, sales and inventory. If sales are rising and inventory is falling, prices are going to go up. What's so different about this coming out of the pandemic era is that um, prices really didn't adjust in the same way you'd expect with mortgage rates more than doubling, right? It didn't, and that's the lock-in effect. That's, if I bought a house at 3.5%, do I really want to put my house on the market and become a buyer at 6.25% or 6.5%? Probably not. And unless I'm sort of forced to, job relocation across the country, just had triplets, whatever. And so now we have this sort of market where we have low sales, because, are not low, but lower than normal, because interest rates are much higher, and and we have a lot of uncertainty right now. I could spend my whole time here talking about the insanity of tariff policy and how that has actually, is the reason why we're having lower mortgage rates. Because that's a tax on the consumer, and the second they were implemented, we saw a lot of, um, a large loss in jobs. Try to be a college student now, graduating and get a job. It's much harder now, than it typically would be. Not all sectors, unemployment is still low, but there's a lot of cracks forming, and that's the reason why the Fed cut rates. So in a weird way, the insanity of tariffs has really helped, or is helping, the housing market right now.
I can't help but think that, yeah, obviously everything relates to everything, but you have you have right now somebody like myself, right? Two
Yeah.
and a half percent we have.
Yeah.
And
You're not
and
moving,
it, right,
probably.
well, yeah. Well, here's the
Well,
thing. Here's the thing that's going to happen to me, though, and I do wonder. I think that regardless of where you live or how, what price point the house is in, I do think that there are probably a lot of people like me that there's of course who gives up 2.5%, but then again, there's a certain percentage of us out there that are at that 2.5% or the 2.75 or the 3,
yeah,
and we're also entering an empty nest stage.
yeah.
And so when you get hit with that, so for me, this is like my it's a process.
Right, right. Well, I think the way I think of it is, uh, the, when someone like yourself that has, a crazy low mortgage rate relative to today. And by the way, do you know what the 50-year average is for the 7%, or we're locking 6.5, 6.3 as a 30-year fix. You know what the 50-year average is for the 30-year?
I'm
Eight, just
guessing 6 or 5, I don't know.
eight. It's
Oh
like
wow.
7.9 or 7.8.
Wow.
It's just under eight. That's the average over 50 years. So I always correct people when they say high mortgage rates. I use the word elevated because they're high relative to 5 years ago, but they're not high historically. Another way to think of it. Um, but the way I think of your scenario, I became an empty nester about 3 years ago, and we downsized by, half, the size, but we got twice as much land and a pool and all that. Um, is that all that happens is the lower the rate, the lower the probability of an immediate move.
Yep.
It doesn't mean that people won't move. It just, the lock-in effect just reduces the probability. The thing is, as much as we fight it, life moves on without you. That people do make moves. But what it ended up doing was delaying the move.
For
And
sure.
and so, ultimately, someone like yourself, there'll be other things you consider in the economy or your job or your outlook on life that'll change your thinking enough for you to make the move. But if you became an empty nester yesterday and mortgage rates are 3%, you'd already have your house on the market, right? I mean, it just delays, what's, what could be done much more quickly or an easier decision with lower rates.
Well, one of the problems, I think, and it was certainly the problem for me, which I'm not out of yet, was wrapping my head around the idea of selling, because we are in a very big house with the pool and everything, and
Yeah,
but we still have the three dogs, we still have the kids, we still have one in
right.
high school, we still have all these things. But the biggest problem, forget all of that. I that I can deal with, was where was I going? Where am I going?
Yeah, where are you gonna, right. And so many, the appreciation, the value of your house is sort of money on paper at this moment because, you have something you're used to, it serves you well and all that. Um, I had uh we downsized 3 years ago to a house that's literally 50% as big, but it's just my wife and I had 4 kids and all are gainfully employed. All have been, engaged or married, we have 4 grandkids. We just didn't need that space.
Right,
We
of
don't have
course.
any dogs or we had cats, but no longer. And so we made the move, but we made the move. We wanted to make the move so bad 3 years ago that we won a 30-way bidding war because uh, because mortgage rates were insanely low and there was no inventory because of the lock-in effect, or not lock-in effect, but just the idea that things are selling so quickly, faster than inventory could come on the market, that we ended up being in a 30-way bidding war and won. Um, and we overpaid by, being an appraiser, kind of is counter to what I stand for, but we were 36% above the asking price. And but by my math, they listed the price way too low, and we only overpaid, only in air quotes, by about 15%. But if you believe like Realtor.com and Zillow, and pricing and all that, we're about 20% above what we paid, right? Because we knew the supply was a long-term challenge, going to be, even if rates went up, and it has been, that we knew that that being an outlier in price back then was not crazy, even though, so that's why I sort of brag about it, like in a sort of irresponsible way. But the way to think of, and and what I did is just what we talked about, is thought about inventory is not going to pile back in. And the only way it would happen very quickly is if rates plummeted from 7 to 2.5 or some crazy number. Then we'd have a stampede of inventory. But that's been unlikely.
You don't think that the mayoral election could lead to inventory?
So I just uh, a an international developer just asked me to write sort of a piece on risk, on risk to developers, and one of them was the New York City election. Others were like interest rate risk, geopolitical risk, that sort of thing. And after really going through it, I think the risk to the housing market in New York City with the new mayor is moderate. It's not high. And the reason I think that is because what is said on the campaign versus the institutions in place and the elected leaders in place, and knowing that over 50% of New York City's tax revenue comes from real estate related things, um, that I think there's been an overreaction to that. I'm not saying it won't have an impact, but there's clearly been, in my mind, an overreaction. Um, uh, and we'll see. We don't really know. That's the uncertainty. One thing that you'll find when you listen to me is I use the word uncertainty a lot, and just to be clear on that, there's always uncertainty, no matter how positive or negative the world is at that given moment. It's when it starts getting really high or really low is when you start to take notice, and it's been really high. And so it's more the risk right now is more about the lack of clarity, understanding. And I bring that up with the tariffs because two countries can negotiate, they agree on a percentage, and then next day the policy is reversed or changed or doubled or tripled, right? So there's a randomness to economic policy that's based on a misunderstanding of what tariffs actually are. And so I look at that as a higher risk to New York City and every location in America, farmers in Tennessee, much more than this mayoral risk. I hope I'm right.
Yeah, no, I hope you are too. I definitely have been hearing from people. There are people that swear they'll move out.
Right. There's a lot of people that said during the last election that they'd move to Canada, if a certain candidate won. Like, there's a lot of things that are said on the moment and then they're amplified on social media, but they end up not really happening.
Right.
So I don't disagree that there's that chatter out there for sure. Everybody's heard it. The question is whether there's an actionable event. And at least at this point, there's no real evidence of some sort of fleeing the city narrative. And we'll see.
What are you seeing on the rental side of things?
Uh, so the rental side, so when you think about what 2025 was a very unusual rental market in that we are having and specific to Manhattan, but universally across the five boroughs, rents have been rising a lot this year and have been in Manhattan in the last 8 months. So through the end of August, 5 of the 8 months have been the highest in history. The median rent was the highest ever tracked. And 3 of the months were the second or third highest in history by like $5. So and what was unusual about 2025 was that rents started soaring upwards in the beginning of the year in the winter. And that's really unusual. It's usually July and August are peak leasing seasons. That's where rent tends to be the highest. Everybody wants to get in before Labor Day. And July, as it turned out, was the peak of the year. And now with mortgage rates trending lower or down a bit from their 2 month ago highs, I'm anticipating a pullback in the fall of rents. So instead of being at record levels, they're just going to be high.
Right.
uh not this sort of rocket ship upper progression that we've been seeing. And I think that's going to be a pretty reliable way to think about it, unless mortgage rates spike or something crazy happens. You have to think about you have to think about they're not polar opposites, but the rental market and the purchase market, uh, the reason why rents have been so high is because you've had people waiting on the sidelines to buy. They've been, I call it camping out in the rental market. And I think with rates falling, I think there's a tremendous pent-up demand level in New York City to buy. I'm not saying it's going to be the biggest housing boom of the modern era, but if Fannie Mae just forecast mortgage rates over the next year to trend a little bit lower, and by 1 year from now, they're talking about like 5.9%, which my sort of wild guess is that when we hit a sixth threshold, there's going to be a mini housing boom. It's a symbolic sort of threshold. It may even happen before that with anticipation. Now, here's what we're seeing on the ground on the purchase market, and I think is very logical, is that there are two more Fed cuts being forecast by Wall Street. At the minimum, one more cut. The Fed has basically said sort of confirmed that there's going to be more cuts by the end of the year. So the question is whether or not mortgage rates will actually fall. Because, just to point out for those who don't keep track, a year ago in September, when mortgage rates were cut by the Fed, I'm not mortgage rates, interest rates were cut by the Fed by 50 basis points. Mortgage rates went up a full percent the next month. Um, so there's not a direct correlation, but it does influence the direction of mortgage rates eventually. Um, so if the damage to the economy from the tariffs accelerates, then we will see mortgage rates continue to fall. And if we see mortgage rates continue to fall, or slip is probably a more appropriate description, I think we're going to have a very robust fall market with more transactions. And when I sort of describe it as getting back to zero, that it's not that we're going to have an extraordinary level of sales, but I think we'll have a more normal level of sales for a fall market. When you think of housing, it's a two hump camel is the way I describe it. You have spring and fall, with the spring being the bigger hump, but fall being sort of a significant hump. And I think we're gonna, the last two spring markets have been very underwhelming. And so I think we're going to have based on, if things continue as we expect, then we could definitely see a more normal transaction market. Into the real estate brokerage or agents out there, it's all about transactions. It's really not about prices. Uh, and transaction volume might normalize. So at least, for in the short term. I think rates will be, drift lower most of next year. Um, a lot's going to depend on whether the tariff policy, the Supreme Court upholds what the appeals court found was that they were unconstitutional.
That they were unconstitutional.
Yeah, that's Congress, Congress's responsibility, and it's not the president's. And the reason why the founding, or why this is, in the Constitution, is so that we don't have what's happened now, where you have one person on a whim, sort of picking, well, I don't like them. Let's raise the rates, or let's lower the rates. And it's based on a sort of a false understanding of what tariffs are. So, for example, if you go to the grocery store and spend $200 on groceries, and you come home with the groceries, the grocery store has your money, you now have a $200 trade deficit with the grocery store. And that's all it is accounting. It's bizarre, right? And that's literally what it is. So all the revenue coming in for the tariffs is excess costs paid by mostly the American consumer, which is
Well,
crazy.
but isn't it, I'm just playing devil's advocate for a second. The US is taxed on everything that goes out of our country into another country.
Right.
Always. We pay tariffs across the board.
Yep.
It stands to reason that it should be the same way.
Yeah. So what you do so if both sides, so there's retaliatory tariffs, right? So what happens is both sides end up paying a lot more, and that gets passed off to the consumer in both countries. So it's counterproductive. Um, uh, our average tariff rate across the world before the tariff policy was about 1%. Now it's 18%.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
and the other way to think of it, I have a son, one of my four boys is in sort of he works for a like a luxury goods manufacturer, like, furnishing in that sort of category. And when he buys one of those containers, or on the container ships uh, of fabric from China, it's about $400,000. That's what they cost. With the tariffs, it's another 250,000. And so what is his company going to do? They're going to
Charge
offload that
more.
cost into their prices. That's what they're doing. So that 400 costs 650 now, right? That's it. Like there's this fantasy that the 250 tariff is paid by the exporter out of China. It's not true. It's paid by the
Right.
importer here, and then the importer passes it along to the consumer. They're not going to pass 100% on, but they're going to pass the majority of it. Goldman Sachs just came out with a study that consumers are paying about 80% so far, but it's rising of that increased tax. So now you have this world where you have all this random costs being added under the guise of a different person's paying it. I mean, just look at grocery prices. My goodness. You look at meat is up like 18%. Why, right? It's because of tariffs. And so if that gets,
But Phil,
normalized,
don't you think food has been so much more expensive way before tariffs?
yes. Yes, it has. It has continued to expand.
Yep.
Um, but it has in the last year, the last 12 months, year over year, it's expanded much more than it has in the past, in the last, past 4 or 5 years. And that's being attributed to the tariffs coming, tariffs on Mexico, tariffs on Canada, our trading partners and allies. And it's all based on a basic misunderstanding of what a tariff is. Um, so, and so that's the economic uncertainty, and it's being translated into significant job loss. And as a result, uh, we will, the Fed is sort of caught between a rock and a hard place because, and this is why, because if you think of inflation you remember, a year and a half ago, where we had like 9% inflation. And so we had inflation based on prices, right? Prices were higher. And so employers that were getting, were seeing this inflation, they could afford to pay more wages to keep employees. Now, the inflation is more cost oriented and the prices are the same. So there's more pressure. And that's why we're having layoffs and, we're having,
Well, that's
we're having sort of this general weakness in the economy right now. Just
well,
go to Disney World or go to Las Vegas right now. Tourism is
right.
down like 8-9% from the sort of state of the economy.
Well, I think that from where I sit personally, and I say this, I've been saying this a lot lately, it's not enough to produce as much as you did last year anymore.
Right.
Because if you're only going to produce that much, you're going to have to
It
cut
costs more to
somewhere
live.
because you're not going to have as much money to live on. You're just not.
Right.
Everything. I mean, there is not one part that has not risen. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, anything related to home ownership, real estate taxes,
Traveling, anything,
insurance. Yeah.
entertainment, everything is just so expensive.
So disposable income, has reduced. It's interesting at the same time that that's happening, people have more home equity in their homes than at any time in history, right?
Yep.
Um, but you're not seeing like a home equity boom like we had, during the housing bubble or before the housing bubble, where people are buying boats and because they're concerned.
Those
There's
were
more
the crazy
concern.
days we all lived.
Yes, it was crazy, right?
Table service, like the crazy table service. And yes, I'm
Yeah,
sure it still goes on to some extent,
yeah.
but not what we did 20, 30 years ago.
No, it was a simpler time, I like to say. Um, but anyway, so it's interesting. So you think about, as a real estate agent, you're thinking about you're dealing with people that are, um, more than less are dealing with sort of economic challenges in their own mind. And the part that I find really interesting, in the context of real estate sales is you've got um, this idea that when you've got I'm trying to think how to describe it. You've got people that uh, we've got a housing, so we've got like, there aren't long lines at employment, of unemployment. Unemployment numbers are low, but you have people more worried about their job. You have this sort of baked in like fear, or, like the nexus between fear and greed is more about fear. Greed was like what you were talking with the table service, like, just, have at it. And so people are being more conservative now about their financial decisions. When I think about um, people waiting for like 3.5, 4 years for rates to fall, and being really, you know, well, when mortgage rates fall, and mortgage rates just fell, 50 plus basis points, 0.5%, um, then I'll buy, right?
Right.
And but now it's like, then I'll wait till the next rate cut because then they'll be lower. The problem with delaying is that housing prices a year from now, 6 months from now, as a general comment, will be either the same or a little bit higher. Now,
Yeah.
that's a market-wide look, individual, yeah, some prices are lower than, sort of a peak period or whatever. But just in aggregate, when you look at like at a county level or a city level, prices a year from now will be higher than they are now. And part of that is in good chunk of the country, like 2/3, 3/4 of the country. So then you think, well, but rates will be lower. Yeah, but the you're waiting for a lower interest rate and your asset price is rising. It's like
Right.
counterproductive, uh, in many ways, and that's what we're seeing, like in the national jump in pending home sales. Is you're seeing, activity pop in August, and it popped because rates fell, and they're doing that because prices will be higher. Um, Maybe not a lot higher. The rate of growth is diminishing, but waiting for rates to fall. What we learned during the pandemic is that when mortgage rates are too low for too long, housing is less affordable.
Yep.
And and when when a buyer is looking at the direction of rates, guess what? The sellers are getting the same memo, right?
Yep.
And so they're thinking, well, I can be less negotiable. Maybe they won't raise their list price, but I can be tighter or tougher on the buyer who might be trying to lowball me. Um, and I think that's what's going to change with these next two rate cuts. So instead of waiting, I think in many ways, I think that's foolish if you're ready to go. Um, I'm
100.
not a big believer in timing markets based on interest rates. Anyway, just food for thought. I think
Right.
that's something to consider.
The other thing is that just like you were saying, if rates go down, more people are buying. But like you
Mhm.
said, prices are going to go up because the competition then is there.
Right.
The only thing, and I don't know if you have these statistics, is there's also, I believe, there's always at any given point in time, there's certain generations that are at that stage of making a move, right? So
Yeah.
kind of getting back to the downsizing thing. So, and like you said, you made a calculated decision. You did over ask. And look, lo and behold, the house is worth more anyway. Same thing happened. Look, we bought our house in 2012, and
Yeah.
it's like, okay, we paid more than we wanted to, but it's going to sell for double, you
Yeah.
know? So it's like,
Yeah. It depends, like I think a lot of people, a lot of buyers, when they buy, they look at it as like a flip. Like, hey, if
mhm,
I have to sell in 2 years, but it's usually a longer term play.
yep,
Depending on what sources you read, the average holding time is 7 to 10 years. that it varies by market. The long-term rule of thumb was 7, but it's really 7 to 10 as the average, right? And a lot happens in a decade, I can assure you, having
Yeah.
lived through many decades. Um, but the other thing is that um, uh, if you think that so as the economy is starting to break right now, and that's why we had rate cuts. But what the inflationary pressures we're seeing are kind of like slowing or making the rate cuts slower than they probably could have been. Um, but there is a downward trend in where rates are going, not for the next 3 months, but for the next couple of years. And it doesn't mean that they're going to correct or go. I think the days of in the fours or threes like that's I don't want to say maybe once in a lifetime, but that's not normal. That's crazy, right?
Well,
And
it ended up in putting us in the situation that we're in.
well, we're in this
Not,
period of
yeah, no
distortion.
interest, no, right, no,
Right, it's a distortion period that we're still in because rates are too low for too long.
yep.
And the other thing to think about, and why I'm so enamored with inventory as a metric, is that inventory is this um sort of, how to say it, it's like this sort of thing, this glowing, living, breathing blob that that evolves and grows over time, and it doesn't respond quickly, unless there's a massive change in interest rates. It just sort of there. And so what happened during the pandemic is rates were too low for too long, and they were wiped off. The inventory was largely wiped off the face of the earth. And so we kind of had to start over. But rates, rose in the last 3.5 years at their mortgage rates rose at their highest ascent in history, and that caused people not to put their house on the market because they've got a 3 year, 30 year. And so that blob sort of stayed the same size. And so I want mortgage rates to be, I think, normal level of mortgage rates. And, honestly, who knows? But my gut is that normal is like 5.75, just under 6. Long term, maybe it's 6. But like the idea of going below that again wipes out supply, and creates more distortion. So, so that's sort of, here we are, like we should learn from our past. And low mortgage rates make housing less affordable. Uh, because they impact you in the short term. Like you're looking to make an offer and rates just drop, and you're like, okay, I can go that little extra, and maybe the seller doesn't really process it yet. But 6 months from now, and mortgage rates are still at that same level, it's all baked in, right? And so why are you waiting? Um, because it's gonna be a more expensive house, for you as a buyer.
Why haven't we seen a massive impact on the 5 to 7 year arms that people were taking in like 2019? I mean, there was a lot of them. And
Yeah,
I would have imagined, if I would have predicted, I would have said there should be a ton of inventory coming on, because how are people that have threes?
yeah, how they refi.
Yeah, right. So how, I'm just surprised.
So what they
Or is
did is
that the
they
inventory that we are seeing?
they refied at a higher rate because they didn't want to move. Um, and it just sort of, it, I don't have a great explanation where I think of, uh, when my youngest son moved to Manhattan, uh, and he and all his friends from high school, they graduated college, they all moved into the city. It's like my hometown got moved to like Midtown Manhattan, and they all, went in when rents were really low during the pandemic, and then rents have gone through the roof, and they're they're all staying. It comes out of their disposable income, but they're all staying. And I think there's been maybe a little bit of part of this, and to your question, is that wages today are higher than
Yes,
pre-pandemic.
yes,
And and they're not as high as they were, 3 years ago, but they're still a lot higher than pre-pandemic, and that has enabled them to my theory is that they enable them to eat that higher reset on their refi.
yep,
Um, and that's what's also different about this is that we haven't seen the same duress individually, because A, everybody's got a ton of home equity, and B, wages are higher. It just doesn't feel as high because inflation or
correct. And
higher
the
costs have
cost
been
of
high.
living is so, the cost of living is
Right,
so much
right.
higher.
So I'm not, sort of being cavalier about like it's not, think costs aren't higher, but part of the what has helped sort of manage that has been higher wages in general. And
And tons of people picking up additional income by
yeah,
way of
yeah,
just
right.
social media and just anything remote working. There's
Yep.
so many extra
There's been a
ways.
lot of that. Well, it's
Yep,
funny because you say remote working because that really had an impact on the housing market, right? You had, people could then, hey, live where they want to live
that's
because
right.
they only had to commute 1 or 2 days a week. And now there's been this whole move, RTO, return to office, in the press, a lot of discussion about that, and, versus work from home. And I kind of laugh about it because, like, one of the things in publishing market research and anything you read, on the internet about the housing market, the source is what matters, right?
Right,
Like, are you getting info from someone who's shilling, that it's a great time to buy, or is it like, logical and, can and so all the big sources that are saying RTO, we're issuing this, blah blah blah. Um, Most of those have an interest in the commercial office market. They have billions, JP Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon said, RTO, and, maybe not 5 days a week, but, close as we can to it and all that. Well, they have billions in mortgages on commercial office buildings. They're a
oh yeah,
tainted source of information.
yep,
And so you should take that with a grain of salt. Like that's not a compelling reason. And so it has not been this sort of blowout change and people are moving back to the office. My analogy, which is not based on any fact, I sort of think it, when they do this, and you're going to have this ebb and flow where people work from home an average of 3 days uh, a week. Wall Street wants 5 days. Bloomberg News is 5 days, right?
oh
So,
wow,
so you have across different industries because they've invested billions in offices. They have
right,
20 years left on their lease. They want their employees using it, right?
right,
And so you think about that, and like as you're trying to understand the housing market, all that matters is the source where you're getting it from. And the whole RTO thing, like to me, that cat's out of the bag, the toothpaste is out of the tube. Like that's never changing, but it's going to ebb and flow. It's going to ebb, I'm making this up,
right,
from 3.1 days a week to 3.8 days a week, right?
right,
And then back to 3.2. Like that's what it's going to be. And you're going to have some industries that are going to be more inclined. And part of that too, think of, the average age of a Wall Street CEO that's dictating this, right? They're in their 60s. They're going to be
right,
retired in, 5, 10 years. And the next generation that grew up on work from home. So it's, that's how you should think about the housing market is like, think about the sources, think about, what your buyers say and where they're getting the information, and a lot of times it's not credible.
right. Jonathan, let me ask you, we only have a few minutes left anyway, but what are you seeing in terms of appraisals?
Hmm.
How has the actual what's going on in terms of transactions and volume and pricing,
Yeah.
how has it impacted the appraisals?
This has been a really quiet, slow couple of years for us in Manhattan. Miller Samuel is basically about a third of our business is sales related, sales and refi, call it interest rate related. I can tell you in the last couple of months, we're seeing a lot more transactions and we're seeing a lot more refis. There's sort of a mini refi boom going on. And so, and we're seeing that, the brokers are seeing that in Manhattan as well. There is definitely an uptick. Um, our other business, which two-thirds of it is sort of legal support, like estate and trust and matrimonial, just general litigation is, just been, it seems, I don't want to say inflation proof or recession proof, but the variable in our business has been transactional. And it's been very weak until the last couple of months, which has been nice to see. Um, the other thing I'll say is that banks, if you look at sort of an historic timeline of being sort of conservative on underwriting or not, they're far more conservative than the long term, but they're less conservative than they were a year ago, is the way I think of it. So they're still erring on the side of caution, but not as insanely as they were, just given a year ago, I'd say.
No, definitely not. I mean, I'm in contract on a property that's an investment property, and me and my partner took a mortgage at 6.75%, which is not bad at all on an investment.
Yeah,
And that was, I mean, it may even be, I think we already locked in, but either way, the one thing I'll say where people are like on the fence of what to do, most of the banks, not all, some, if there might be a prepayment penalty on some of them, but most of them, there's not. Most of them, you may have to wait a year, but if you went and you got a mortgage right now at 6%, and whether you pay a point for it or not, but you could then bring it down a point come next year, refinance then.
right, right.
Because if your theory holds true, which in my opinion, and I've been watching the markets and been involved in them for 30 years now, it does always go up.
Yeah,
It's gonna go up as long as you can wait.
right,
Wait out the punches, whatever those might be.
right.
And so it doesn't, so if that's gonna be the case, then why wait because of the 0.5% when, like you said, your property is
Prices will
probably
be higher.
20% more.
Yeah,
You're making it up on the increased value by having, overpaid 3 years ago.
right, right. That's, yeah, it just depends when you're buying. Is the purchaser have a short window, medium window, or long window? Like, what is their plan? Plans change, but most people when they buy a house, it's the biggest transaction of their life, and it's a longer term, 7 to 10 years at a minimum,
Right.
probably. Or that's the average, but I certainly know, it's anecdotal, but it seems like all my peers have been in houses for 10 years or more. Um, and the idea of, buying something for 3 years and flipping it or whatever, like that's not this
Exhausting.
world.
Right.
That was another time. Oh,
Yeah.
by the way, just as a sidebar, sort of unrelated, but most of the reality shows that are flipping shows, they're all in Canada. Almost
Huh.
every one. There's a few that aren't, but most of them are. And the reason is that they didn't have the big correction after our Lehman moment back during the bubble. They just kept going higher. I mean, they're in rough condition right now too, but their prices have continued to rise, and ours have been much more volatile. So,
Well, yeah, and there's those companies out there that were going and buying all of these homes, thinking that they knew something different than we knew, and
right,
taking baths.
right, right. So it's uh, there's a lot of information out there. Just care about the source where it's coming from. That's the most important thing.
All right. Jonathan, it's so great having you on. It was so great to see you.
Yeah, likewise.
In the 5 minutes we have, if you could answer this question, what impact will the Compass Anywhere deal, where do you see it impacting the brokerage market the most in terms of what's going to change? What will be the, what do you predict to be the biggest thing we're going to see?
Uh, I, first of all, I wrote a huge piece on this the other day.
Okay.
I have a website called Housing Notes, and I wrote about the Anywhere Compass transaction. So the ultimate long term, based on what Compass has said, is going to be reduced fee splits for brokers. So,
Ah,
and the reason for that is because because now if and it's still a question mark. Since I wrote the piece on Monday, I'm more, I've sort of learned more about the odds of regulatory approval, and the odds are falling of approval. They're still high, but they're falling. And that's like a 5 hour discussion I won't bore you with. But the reason I think fee splits are going to fall for real estate agents with this merger is because of what they've said, which is that they're trying to reduce dependency on the agents. So as they grow, right now when the merger's approved, they're going to be 3 times larger in gross commissions than the second place, the new second place, which will be eXp Realty. And so all those brands, I don't know whether they're going to keep, as they say, they're going to keep the brands or not. But I think the first thing they're going to do is the day they're approved, they're going to cut off all the feeds to Zillow and Realtor.com. They're going to go double down on private listings so that they can double dip on the commissions and basically not inform the buyer. There's going to be a lot of litigation um, by consumers against agents who didn't know that only 3 people saw their listing, or the buyer didn't know that the listing was on the market for 18 months. And all those things factor into price discovery. How do you think about what you're going to pay for a property? Ultimately, you're going to reduce competition, and that's going to, typically what happens, if a broker's or an agent work with a firm and they're getting X%, one of the primary reasons they go is because they're going to another firm because they're going to get X plus 5%. They're going to get a higher split. A lot of those firms are, there's going to be a sort of a culling of the herd of the remaining firms. And I do think this is because the only way, Compass has barely been able to make a profit. Just recently, it's been very thin. And the only way in my opinion, based on public information, is that the only way they can really make money in the long term, be a viable entity. Remember, if I gave you $2 billion in capital, Jamie, I think you could start a national real estate company too, right? I mean, uh, uh, like it's an insane, they're disrupted by capital. And what they have to do is be a viable concern. And the way they're going to do it, what's the brokerage's biggest expense? It's commissions that the split. Um, and I think it's going to promote a rise more boutique sort of mid-sized firms that will compete and offer the services that the IMF probably can't. That's my 50 cent overview.
all right. Sounds good. Well, we appreciate that, Jonathan. Great to see you. For
My
your
pleasure.
great information from Jonathan Miller, always. Love having him on.